So I just want to begin by saying good evening. Oh, there, good, thank you. Okay, you got us in the right groove. My name is Paul Contino. I'm from Pepperdine University in California, and it's a great gift to be here. Thanks to everyone who's here, old friends, new friends. Before I turn to our distinguished panel, a brief word about a work in progress. In the spirit of Oki's exhortation, we've got to keep this going, okay? I would like to tell you, well, first I'll give you an image. Like Pope Francis, I like to think in images. This one's from the Commedia. It's near the end. Dante receives a vision of luminous wholeness. He writes, "Within the light's depths I saw gathered together, bound by love, pages that lie scattered throughout the universe." It all comes together at that moment. My colleague Mike Murphy, who sits back there, and I have been envisioning working together as editors to gather together the scattered luminous pages from this conference and from writers beyond. I'm thinking of writers from China, from Latin America, but clearly the global Catholic literary aesthetic imagination is alive. And there's a world that's hungry for it, and a book, I think, would nourish people who hunger, may not know that they hunger for it, but an encounter with that imagination. So all this is to say, stay tuned. Michael and I will be emailing you and begin conversing about the possibilities of putting a book like this together. But now let's turn to Dante with no further ado. Dante and the Catholic imagination today. So we have four very distinguished panelists, and I'm just going to say that we'll go in this order, if it's okay. Vittorio first. Vittorio has written, he's from Cambridge, a beautiful book about human encounter in Dante. I highly recommend this book. I'm so glad he's with us from Siena. Then we'll go with John, okay? And John McCourt has written some wonderful things on James Joyce and Irish writers. He's going to talk about Dante's resonance in the Irish authors. Then we're going to turn to the more creative writers. We'll turn to Angela Alema O'Donnell first. She's a wonderful literary critic. She's educated us a great deal about Flannery O'Connor, but she's also a wonderful poet who was inspired, I think it was during COVID, to write poems inspired by Dante's Commedia. And then finally, we will, we'll go to, well, why don't we end with you then, Randy? We'll go with, you'll get us laughing, I suspect, somehow. If you've not read this wonderful trilogy, we're 2/3 of the way through it now, and I'm waiting for Paradise. Is there laughter in Paradise?
That's the problem.
Well, no, we'll allow that. Highly recommended, okay? And so we'll conclude. Tim, the sculptor, couldn't be here, but do you see that work up there? That's by Timothy Schmaltz. He's done these gorgeous sculptures inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. I was in Florence last year, got to see some of these in the Badia. We're right in Dante's neighborhood, where we used to go to church, as you described, Randy, earlier. So anyway, with no further ado, let's turn to Vittorio and your remarks about Dante today. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yep, excellent. Thank you everyone. It's a true joy and a privilege to be here and to be part of this wonderful conversation. Our panel is about Dante, a love poet and political exile who lived 700 years ago in Italy. And we're here to reflect on the significance that his work, and especially the Divine Comedy, has for the global aesthetics of the Catholic imagination. And even just having said that, we get a sense that to reflect on the various layers of history, politics, culture, art, theology, and spiritual life, to reflect, that is, on the unique combination of journeys and encounters that bring us here today would require a conference unto itself. In my present remarks, I wish to take the lead from Pope Francis's apostolic letter, Candor Lucis Aeternae, dedicated to Dante and his work, to highlight what I believe is one of the most important dimensions of Dante's significance for us today. Pope Francis invites us to recognize in Dante's comedy, which tells the story, as you know, of Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, a very specific and particular journey, and also a journey that we all share, a journey that we can all share, a journey that has global significance, not because we can repeat it, but because we can all live out our own particular journey that shares in what Pope Francis refers to as Dante's radical commitment to hope and to divine mercy. As an exile and pilgrim, Pope Francis says, Dante was powerless, yet he was able to imagine, take, and offer us a journey from the depths of hell to the vision of God. As Pope Francis puts it, quote, Dante the exile, the pilgrim, powerless yet confirmed by the profound interior experience that has changed his life, was reborn as a result of the vision that, from the depths of hell, from the ultimate degradation of our humanity, elevated him to the very vision of God. He thus emerged as the herald of a new existence, the prophet of a new humanity that thirsts for peace and happiness. End quote. Pope Francis then goes on to say that, I'm quoting again, and I hope, I'm quoting at length, but I hope this gives you a sense of the richness that is there in Pope Francis's reflections on Dante. Quote, the journey that Dante presents is not illusory or utopian. It is realistic and within the reach of everyone. For God's mercy always offers the possibility of change, conversion, new self-awareness, and discovery of the path to true happiness. End quote. This seems to me the core of Pope Francis's invitation to engage with Dante today. The recognition that in Dante one finds a radical commitment to mercy that can, in hope, accompany us on all our journeys too. One of the most important ways in which, according to Pope Francis, Dante can continue to accompany us in and through the work is in and through the work of contemporary artists. And I quote at even greater length, but I think it's especially relevant in our context here. Quote, in a special way, I encourage artists to give voice, face and heart, form, color, and sound to Dante's poetry by following the path of beauty which he so masterfully traveled, and thus to communicate the most profound truths and to proclaim in the language of their art a message of peace, freedom, and fraternity. At this particular moment in history, overclouded by situations of profound inhumanity and the lack of confidence and prospects for the future, the figure of Dante, prophet of hope and witness to the human desire for happiness, can still provide us with words and examples that encourage us on our journey. Dante can help us to advance with serenity and courage on the pilgrimage of life and faith that each of us is called to make, until our hearts find true peace and true joy, until we arrive at the ultimate goal of all humanity, the love which moves the sun and the other stars. Those are the words with which Dante's comedy ends. So, I'm not an artist, and I cannot presume, especially in such distinguished company at this conference, to speak on how artists can best respond to Pope Francis's invitation. But I would like to highlight one of the key respects in which I think Pope Francis's emphasis on mercy can indeed be illuminating for us today. For there is more to it than first meets the eye. So, after saying that no human being is excluded from the path of divine mercy, the primary example from Dante's comedy that Pope Francis refers to is that of the Emperor Trajan, who, according to the legend that Dante follows in his poem, was, on account of his mercy, brought back to life from hell, thanks to the prayers of Pope Gregory the Great. Having been brought back to life through those prayers, Trajan recognized divine mercy and was saved. So quite an extraordinary story. Pope Francis does not refer explicitly to Pope Gregory's prayers in his apostolic letter. Yet if we reflect on the implications of these prayers, as imagined by Dante, for thinking about divine mercy, some striking interpretive possibilities open up. If we factor Pope Gregory's prayers for Emperor Trajan into Pope Francis' interpretation of mercy in the Comedy, one striking and indeed radical interpretive possibility that opens up is that the path of divine mercy is so inclusive and all-encompassing as to be available also in hell. And if that's the case, then we need to ask ourselves how ultimately to read Dante's poem and the value it can have for us today. For it could, in fact, appear counterintuitive to think of Dante as a poet of fraternity and of mercy, given that he also appears and is most famous for being the poet of judgment and condemnation, who pridefully plays God and presents in his Inferno countless fellow human beings as damned. So how can we take this poem that includes the Inferno as a poem of fraternity and mercy? But if we take Gregory's prayers for Trajan, we might recognize in Dante's poem a commitment to divine mercy as indeed ultimately stronger than hell, and certainly stronger than any attempt like Dante's, any human attempt, to imagine what hell is like or who might inhabit it. It is indeed the case that Pope Francis' letter speaks very little about hell, as if indeed he wants to suggest, against what today is still the most popular way of reading Dante, that what really matters spiritually about Dante's comedy is not ultimately Dante's attempt to judge others, but his ability to lead himself and us on a journey towards recognizing divine mercy as ultimately stronger than our judgments. And I think this is indeed very relevant for us today in reflecting on how contemporary art can encounter Dante and present Dante to us in refreshed ways. We live in an increasingly polarized world, tempting us more and more away from recognizing the value of mercy and towards presuming we can judge others definitively, able to tell who is sinful and who is not, often blinding ourselves to our own shortcomings. To recognize even in Dante, even in the poet of the Inferno, a radical commitment to mercy that appears to be stronger than hell itself. And also to recognize even in Dante a critical self-awareness of his own limitations is to recognize in Dante's work resources that I think can help us both to diagnose our own presumption and to work our way out of it. And in our increasingly divided world, I think there is no greater gift than this. Thank you.
Please go to it, John. Yeah, we're just going to go one after the other, okay. And then we'll 8 minutes each, and then we'll open it to conversation.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Yeah, I've got Dante, Joyce, Beckett, and Heaney. 8 minutes. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Poet che mi guidi, guarda la mia virtù, se ella è possente prima che all'altro tu mi fidi. From Dante, of course, and in Kieran Carson's translation, no poet guiding me, before you trust me to this epic task, consider if I'm fit to go with thee. So I'll take that as my send-off as I try to get through this talk. It's really hard to know where to start. Dante continues to talk to us through his work, through his translations, through the many adaptations, the many works inspired by him. Few of the great writers of the 20th century, and indeed of our own century, have failed to absorb or to try to come to terms with his work, and we owe him a huge collective debt. As W.B. Yeats said in another context, talk to me of originality and I will turn on you with rage. So to ignore what's there for a writer would of course be self-defeating. Or Osip Mandelstam, who said of Dante, it is inconceivable to read Dante's cantos without directing them towards contemporaneity. They were created for that purpose. They are missiles for capturing the future. They demand commentary in the futurum. His contemporaneity is continuous, incalculable, and inexhaustible. And I think there's huge evidence that that is true. Elements of his writing, the grandeur of his design, the beauty of his poetry, the range of his vision, have affected so many of our great writers and so many of the great writers who follow him, and the not so great. Joyce, Beckett, and Heaney, in their work we find a huge entanglement with Dante's opus. At times, perhaps an anxiety of influence. We think of Heaney's essay with its title, Envies and Identifications, Dante and the Modern Poet, which seems to point in this direction. But at times, I would argue also an ecstasy of influence. Influence is not only something that paralyzes, it can be something which enables, and I think Dante's role is far more that of enabling. Beckett called him, of course, the divine Florentine. Joyce said, I love Dante almost as much as the Bible. The rest is ballast, referring to Italian literature. A bit harsh, but certainly Joyce was never one for mincing his words. And he describes him in Finnegan's Wake as the divine comic denti alligator. And of course that gives you the sense that if you get too close, Dante will bite your writer's hand off, being an alligator with big teeth, denti alligator. He talks about the most dentalizing peaches in the lingerous, longerous book of the dark, which is, of course, his own Finnegan's Wake. The most dentalizing. Dante, I sing. No, so singing Dante. The most dentalizing peaches. So all throughout Finnegan's Wake, there is this kind of reiteration of Dante's centrality. Ulysses itself seems to reenact the kind of journey that we were just hearing about towards some kind of salvation or some kind of redemption or some kind of reconciliation, or is it resignation? But in any case, some kind of mercy and forgiveness on Bloom's part towards Molly. For these writers, Dante and his use of language is of course key. Dante's self-identification as Florentinus et exul, this idea of being an exile, this idea of not having a homeland, of being displaced as a writer, of being in between. This kind of in-between state of the writer is something I think that Beckett certainly felt in France, actually choosing to write in French. Joyce certainly felt in his various places in Europe. And Heaney also talks about that with regard to his own writing, of being in between. And we just heard about what it's like growing up in Northern Ireland, where you have to belong, and the writer trying not to just be in one particular tribe, I suppose. So that in a way is the state of the writer, isn't it? Of being perhaps in between or slightly displaced, and looking in at a society. And of course, Dante himself in De Vulgaris Eloquentia writes, Nos autem cui mundus est patria velut piscibus equor. To me, the whole world is a homeland, like the sea to fish. And that's, of course, a restatement by Dante of something that we find in Ovid. And again, that idea of originality is not there, but that these great works keep recycling, as we can see in the works of Joyce and Beckett and Heaney when they come to use Dante, and when they come to be affected by his use of the maternum locutionem, the mother tongue. Okay, this choice of abandoning Latin for Italian, something which made Italian and the vernacular become the language of poetry. And of course, the Catholic Church had to wait centuries before the vernacular would become the language of religion and the language of prayer. In a way, poetry opening a way for that. I suppose another thing that they take from him is his focus on the local, his focus on art as a medium for redemption. But most of these Irish writers have trouble with redemption. They tend to be happier in Dante's purgatory or even in his hell, rather than to suggest images that are anything other than fleeting on Paradiso. So there's a focus. What they take from Dante, I suppose, is his focus on the complexity of the human condition. Beckett, for example, takes so much from Dante's damned, condemned to endless circling with no seeming exit. We read his character Ham, the end is the beginning, and yet you go on. And of course what Beckett takes from Dante is the truth, that's the striving for truth about men, not the truth about God. So you can take a lot from Dante without necessarily buying into the hope of redemption. And yet you have to take that seriously as well. Beckett's divine comedy, of course, he carried with him all through his life, the same copy. He describes it in one of his novels, beslubbered with notes from his time in Trinity College. And interestingly, he always kept the same bookmark, which is a copy of Giotto's painting of St. Francis feeding the birds, which I find kind of amazing. He had that throughout his life, and it was one of the very few things he took to the old folks' home for the last year of his life in Paris, was that copy and that bookmark which he'd had from when he was a young boy in Trinity in Dublin. Obviously, Seamus Heaney's poetry draws on the Inferno in the early poetry, North, a poem like Punishment, a poetry of hell. He draws on Dante to try and find a means of responding to the troubles, a way out, or a way to at least try to come to terms with the darkness, though he'd later revise that and wonder about how successful that had been, slipping into the lyric in order to try to come to terms with murder and death. And then, of course, he writes his own divine comedy, Station Island, which is infused with influence from Dante. Dante, of course, evokes at the end of the Paradiso the light of faith, a spark which afterward dilates to vivid flame, and like a star in heaven is sparkling in me. Or, as we already heard, the love which moves the sun and the other stars, and as is seen by Virgil and Dante at the end. We don't find that move towards the light in these Irish writers, but we certainly find the journey and the same kind of striving. It's very different what we find in Beckett. We think of the line from Murphy, the sun shone, having no alternative, on the nothing new. It's hard to be about as far away from Dantean view in that line at the opening of Murphy, where there's the divine seems to be denied, and even the very sense of meaning, the very idea of meaning seems to be denied. Joyce is more circumspect. Joyce remains, despite all of his protests to the contrary, a deeply Catholic writer. There's no question that his work is infused with Catholicism. That is God, Stephen Dedalus says, a shout in the street. So this evocation of the God of the everyday, the God found in a small gesture like that. Or we could perhaps hear something Dantean in what I consider the most lyrical line in Ulysses, which seems to echo in some way what I just read about the star in heaven, the stars in heaven. Joyce's line, the heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruit. It's a beautiful line. It's a beautiful image. But of course, Joyce can never leave it there. He has to deflate it utterly when we're reminded that it's seen by Stephen and Dedalus as they prepare to urinate in the back garden of 7 Eccles Street, which takes some of the lyric beauty out of the line. And yet it's there. Joyce leaves it with us. And yes, his novel also finishes on a positive note. It finishes with a yes. It finishes with Bloom returning to the bed. It finishes with Molly ultimately saying yes, and there is the idea that they get up and face the next day together. It's not paradise, it's anything but paradise, but a journey has been travelled. So I think these 3 writers in very different ways are absolutely saturated with Dante's poetics. They may not be convinced, as he is, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that they take us through, that there is no end to the tunnel in Beckett. I think there is kind of an end to the tunnel in Joyce, and I think Heaney strove, especially in his later life, to find light and to find, the famous line about history and hope. And perhaps that also reflected the changing times in Northern Ireland when it began to become possible to see something more positive towards the future. A whistle-top tour, I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I think I will advance. There we go. When we were organizing this conference, Mark and Michael and I were talking about the various panels that we should have, and we agreed that there was no way we could do a conference on the Catholic imagination in Italy without a panel on Dante, the greatest of Catholic poets. So I'm honored to be part of this panel today and to speak about my project, Dear Dante. It was actually an accident. Many poetic projects start as accidents. I started reading Dante in preparation for the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, September 14th, 1321. And as you know, the world was preparing for this anniversary, and it was going to be a worldwide celebration of the Commedia. So the summer before, I began reading one canto of the Inferno a day. And since there are 100 cantos and there are about 100 days in summer, it seemed like a perfectly poetic way to spend the summer, to read a canto a day. What I didn't expect, though, was that I would begin talking back to Dante. So after reading a canto, I would feel like, I think I want to say something about this. And so what started out as a kind of project of being a reader and a consumer of the Inferno and of the Commedia, then turned into a species of accompaniment, where I would walk with Dante each day through Inferno, through Purgatorio, through Paradiso, and have a conversation with him. So the result is, I did not write 100 poems. I ended up writing 13 for each canto, and then a prologue and an epilogue to the group, 2 epilogues actually, and so there's a total of 42 poems. Some of the poems dig into Dante, and they sort of follow him along the journey. Dante sort of becomes like my Virgil as he's guiding me through these various horrific places in the case of Inferno and Purgatorio, and lovely places in the case of Paradiso. But in other of the poems, there's criticism of Dante, or at least questioning, interrogation. We were talking about the necessity of the transgressive of the Catholic imagination. And there's some, let's face it, the world has changed since 1321, and there's some aspects of Dante's theology that we modern people do not see in exactly the same way. So some of the poems engage Dante in a kind of interrogation, conversation. All of the poems are in one of the 2 forms that Dante used. Of course, he creates the beautiful terza rima, and then, of course, he wrote sonnets as well, so they're all formal poems. And then the last thing I'll say before I'll read a couple of poems is that I didn't actually notice what time I started. Oh, well, here we go. I felt a little silly writing little poems and setting them beside Dante's big poem. There is a kind of a sense of presumption, of course, in that. But Dante didn't seem to mind, so I figured I would continue. And the dedication to the book is to Dante, il miglior fabbro, of course, Dante, the better craftsman, from Canto 26 of Purgatorio. So I will read a couple of these poems as time permits. And the first one, let me move, oops, I have to be pointing. Okay, go past that one. They never quite work, thank you. One more forward. Okay. The first one is a sort of a letter to Dante, and the book takes its title from this. And there is a kind of a recognition here of the fact that Dante is writing his great philosophical theological poem in poetry, which is not always the most respected way of doing this. And so here is Dear Dante. And it begins with an epigraph from the great Italian-American poet John Ciardi, who once said, "A poem ought to be free to lie its way to the truth." All poets are liars. St. Thomas says so, yet you choose verse to tell the truth. We glide along on your easy terza rima, each line, each hanging rhyme, pulling us into deeper, more dangerous waters. You can't look away, and neither can we, from the suffering shades, the pure agony of unchanging pain for eternity. No respite from the mind's and the body's fire. If you hated your kind, you could not dream a worse world than your endless hell, a liar's pandemonium no loving words can soothe. Lured by your language, we blindly follow you. Pray none of the things you write come true. One of the episodes in Inferno that I think most trouble us as modern people is the canto in which we find the suicides in hell. We understand that there are other sources of suicide rather than corruption, deep spiritual corruption that cause people to take their own lives. And so how do we deal as modern readers with this particular canto? One thing that is always comforting to me when I read it is that Dante is weeping. Dante is a hot mess, actually, for a lot of Inferno and Purgatorio. He is very much in sympathy with the sinners. And even though theologically he's not supposed to be, there's this human side of Dante that he cannot deny. And so there is a kind of both and with Dante, in which he's playing two roles, the pilgrim who's being taken along, the human pilgrim, and also being instructed. So this particular poem is a sonnet, but it also, if you'll notice, is a sonnet that has a monorhyme. Every single line ends with the same sound. And the reason for that is I was trying to, in some way, replicate the sense of the obsessive sort of thinking that often goes along with people who have suicidal ideation. So this is Dante among the suicides. The epigraph comes from Inferno 13. The poet, Virgil, the poet waited briefly, and then he said to me, "Since he is silent, do not lose this chance, but speak and ask what you would know of the suicide. And I, do you continue, ask of him whatever you believe I should request. I cannot, so much pity takes my heart." The forest of suicides, the darkest place for Dante and for us. The tortured, faceless, their bodies are not theirs. No saving grace allows them to reclaim themselves. They are erased forever. Their flesh become dead wood, disgraced for a moment's mortal error. No place for mercy in their maker's mind, so base is this act in God's eyes. And yet, encased in Dante's chest is a heart like ours, birthplace of love for the sinner in the face of sin. He's learning that life is a race none of us can win. We're all in last place. Some of us fall, can't keep the killer pace. Perfection is a dream the heartless chase. Not all of these poems are very, very serious. One of the interesting things about Dante is I think there is humor in all of Dante, and even in Paradise. Randy just said there is no humor in Paradise, but I think there is. So this is sort of a meditation on the contemporary person's response to being in hell. In Purgatorio. Actually, I have to credit my moderator here, Paul Contino. We were on a panel together a couple of years ago at the Catholic Imagination Conference in 2019, and Paul revealed that he asked his students after reading Purgatorio to write some postcards from Purgatory. And so I said, I just can't wait to get home to do that. So this is postcard from Purgatory number 1. And the epigraph comes from the very first lines of Purgatorio. To course actions more kindly water, to course across more kindly waters now, my talent little vessel lifts her sails, leaving behind herself a sea so cruel. Dear Mom, it's fine here, I'm surprised to say, much better than I thought it would be. My room is clean, though the hotel is seedy. The roaches are small and sleep during the day. The pool is full of algae and slime, a thick stew of goo chartreuse. Yet I find swimming in it cures my blues. There's no time to wallow in guilt and rue. They keep us busy. Gentle devils cheer as we fail and try, time and time again, to climb steep hills of garbage, compost of our sin. We get to the top and slide down again. When we run on hot coals, I come in first. It's no spring picnic, but I've seen worse. Okay. 2 more? Okay, 1 more? Okay, is that okay? Okay. Yes, I wouldn't want to to leave without mentioning Virgil. Paul and I actually have an argument about this. In Purgatorio, Virgil explains that the place that he is going to go back to after he gets done leading Dante through Inferno and Purgatorio is back to Limbo. This gives him, great grief that he has to go back there. He's been a really good sport through all of this, right? And he needs to go back. So he explains to them, there is a place down there not saddened by torments, but by darkness, where the laments do not sound as shrieks, but are sighs. And this is in Terza Rima. What he did not do, his cause for grief, an eternity of regret, one long dark night without relief, time to brood, never to forget what he's missing, joy that might have been the prize he wants but cannot get. It seems cruel, given that his sin is a mild one, considering all, his error being one of omission, unlike the one that caused the first fall, an act that brought creation to its knees, that grieves us still and appalls every living soul, made us unfree, kills us even down to this day. Virgil was blind. He just couldn't see that God was God. He had no way to know the future. Gripped by the past, he walked in darkness. Here his sorrows lay, his place of undoing, his lot cast with blameless victims of a sad fate. The first of poets lives among the lost, cursed by knowledge that arrived too late. And I'll finish just with the last sonnet of the book, which is a kind of send-off and appreciation of Dante. And it is called Dante's Bargain. Let's see if I can get there. Oh. It's probably the last one. One more. There we go. Dante gave all he owned for a piece of Florentine sky, a star above the firmament, a blaze that has not died despite the 700 years that came and quickly went. His tale of exile and his tears, the lifetime that he spent composing lines, creating rhymes to make the perfect poem, have all survived the test of time. No poet's better known. He earned his fame. He paid the price. A Dante doesn't happen twice. Thank you.
I'm very mindful of the fact that you will now see me 3 times over the course of this conference, and in Dantean terms, that means there's an Inferno experience, a Purgatorio experience, and a Paradiso experience. Being the last speaker before we go to dinner, I'm going to presume this is Purgatorio. I think the theme of my remarks about Dante is that Dante always gets the last laugh. A week ago, I was on an island near Detroit reading from Dante's Indiana for a migratory bird sanctuary fundraiser, which could just show up in one of my future novels in and of itself. It was a Dantean experience in and of itself, but one of the parts of it was a chapbook was created as part of this fundraising for the birds. Writers at Rest. So the idea is a writer talks about something that they do alongside their writing, and so I talked about hiking as a writer, hiking with my family. So I'm just going to read to you from that, and you'll see why it connects to Dante. Vacuuming potato chips out of the family car on a Saturday morning while listening to a BBC radio adaptation of the Divine Comedy, I noticed that Dante was breathing hard as he made his way down through the 9 circles of hell. I'd read the poem many times, but his struggling for breath made sudden, striking sense. For all the metaphysical, philosophical, political, and literary moves and marvels at work, the poem is profoundly physical from its famous start. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. As everyone in this room knows, to find his way, Dante's autobiographical protagonist has to climb down a sinner and demon-crowded inverted mountain amid jagged rocks, broken paths, raging fires, and noxious air. After clambering along Satan's frozen haunches at the pit of hell, Dante ascends to the calm terraces of Mount Purgatory, which are thick with grateful, forgiven sinners, before he reaches bright and starry paradise. Here, Dante passes from sphere to harmonious sphere, each featuring the joyfully saved, all of them seeing and being seen by God. Of course, he was breathing hard. Many hundreds of scholars, readers, and writers, including one of Dante's own sons, have written companions and commentaries for the poem dating almost immediately from its completion. Having thought about reading and writing books while hiking in upstate New York with my family, and then likewise in upcountry Sri Lanka, William Faulkner on my mind on Bear Mountain, William Faulkner again on my mind, this time at the Boyagutta Plantation House in upcountry Kandy, I was certain I had come up with a completely new angle while listening to that radio dramatization. I would write a hiker's guide to Dante. And so, at the University of Toronto, I set to work with some excellent undergraduates on a geospatial mapping of Inferno. But, my dear Catholic imagination friends, I'm even less credible as an academic researcher than I am as a hiker. I gave up on the hiker's guide to write a novel instead, Dante's Indiana, about an evangelical millionaire who builds a Dante theme park in an opioid-ravaged small town. When the novel was about to be published in September 2021, I was full of wrath and envy upon learning that Italy's annual Ravenna Festival was going to mark the 700th anniversary of Dante's death and the completion of the Divine Comedy with a public reading of the poem that would take place as listeners hiked together. Now, I should know better than to complain like this. I mean, it was obviously my idea first. But Dante's poem shows us what happens to people who become trapped in their own selfish thinking. They are doomed for all eternity in brutally fit ways, like the wrongful lovers, Paolo and Francesca, like Bertrand de Born, who sowed division between England's King Henry III and his son, and so, as we all know, walks around hell separated from his own head, which he carries around like a lantern. Beyond my own researching a hiker's guide and eventually writing a Dante American novel, I've explored Florence with my wife Anna. I've taught selections from the poem to university students every September. I've studied centuries-old illuminations of the poem in the rare books libraries at various universities. I brought the poem with me on visits to creationism theme parks in Kentucky, where hiking would have been impossible because of all the motorized scooters. That was a morbid obesity joke, but nobody seemed to get it. Above all else, I've read a canto a day, every day for 5 years. In other words, I've joined generations of other writers and readers across centuries and continents and languages in making Dante part of my life, while hiking or otherwise. I read and reread Dante's epic because it shows me what matters most is what happens next. We can refuse to make amends, Inferno. We can seek to make amends, Purgatorio. We can be amended, Paradiso. Understanding myself through the fullness of Dante's work is both humbling and enlarging, a source of relief and a spur to action. Even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. And we should do all that we can to make sure the others in our lives know and feel the same. Now, that said, by far the most difficult reckoning I think we can have with the Divine Comedy happens in its final section. Inferno offers endless situations that, alas, too easily make sense by looking around us. Purgatorio is technically the most exclusively Catholic part of the poem, but I think anyone can understand wanting to put in time and effort to get to a better place and welcoming help along the way. Whereas I propose we are as confused as Dante when he meets Picarda, who is the first soul he finds in Paradiso. She's happy to be where she is forever, even if it's the lowest sphere of heaven. This is where God has placed her, and she explains, quote, "The power of love subdues our will, so that we long for only what we have and thirst for nothing else." Believer, agnostic, atheist, Dante lover, Dante hater, Dante ignorant, can any of you imagine being delighted with who and where you already are, and what you have already gained and been given with no prospect of anything else? Hell no. We are all in the middle of the journey of our lives. But in its fullness, after 700 years, can the Divine Comedy inspire and even challenge us to hope that this journey and its many longings may end so believably well? Heavens, yes. Thank you.
Really, this is just wonderful. Sometimes I give lectures on Dante and I begin with a free association. What's the first word that comes to mind? Dante. Hell, no. The goal is to think love. And I think these panelists have helped us to see why love is at the center. I mean, for me to hear that Samuel Beckett carried that book, he's the bleakest writer I ever read, and I read almost everything he wrote in a seminar, with that Giotto image. I'll live with that, you know? I mean, that's a sign of hope right there. But what I want to do is, I want to get questions from you all, but I'll try to say this in like 2 minutes. This is my question to the panel. Mark quoted William Lynch, Christ and Apollo. I read that book in 1983. I still remember a line where he says, Dante's decisive dance of the definite. There's a lot of D's there. In other words, Dante, like Christ, descends into finitude in order to ascend. It's the only way. Descend that you may ascend. That means, as was said earlier in one of the panels, that decisions, choices matter. Dorothy Sayers described the Inferno as the drama of the soul's choice. I mean, think of C.S. Lewis. Hell is locked from the inside, that they're choosing it themselves somehow. Okay. That's Dante, the judgment, okay? But yet, and I want to use that phrase from Pope Francis, which I'll always hold on to, and hold it next to negative capability, incomplete thinking, you know, dwelling in uncertainties, in possibilities. My argument with Angela about Virgil really rests in many ways on the first image we heard. The image, Paradise 2021, in which we learn that Trajan is among the saved, and also Ripheus, who lived thousands of years before Christ. He died in the Trojan War. How could this be? And there's a wonderful humorous moment in Mandelbaum's translation. They form an eye in the eye of the eagle, and the eagle winks, as if like, you know, don't sweat this, Dante. It's going to be all right, you know. After he hears the doctrine about salvation through Christ, we have this surprise, this incomplete thinking. I do think that Dante offers nourishment here and now. I loved the 700th birthday celebrations as they took place. I guess I want to ask the panelists, but maybe you too will have ones you want to share. Is there a particular nourishing image that you take away from the Commedia, from Dante's journey, that for you is kind of food for the journey, wherever it may be? I see you nodding vigorously, Randy. I know you have many from your book.
I've got one immediately, if I could.
What's the one?
Belacqua from, I think, the 5th canto of Purgatorio. He was a minor musician, and Dante sees him sitting underneath the shade of a rock.
Oh, Belacqua. Yeah.
And Dante says, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
"Well, I'm waiting. I'll go up at some point." And what Dante points out is that in life, he was lazy.
Yeah.
And in the afterlife, he's lazy. And I think that's brilliant, right? That sense of continuity. You are the person you are on both sides of that dividing line. So he'll go to heaven at some point, but he's not in any rush. That, for me, is my favorite
image. And Beckett
image.
loved this, right? Dante and the Lobster, the character's name is Belacqua. You know, he's a kick. Yeah, he's very funny. How about you, Vittorio? Did one come to mind?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind is at the end of Paradiso 28. I was referring to Pope Gregory the Great earlier. At the end of Paradiso 28, Pope Gregory the Great is presented by Dante as having made a mistake on this really serious business of the angelic hierarchies. But it doesn't matter. He gets to heaven, recognizes he made a mistake, smiles and laughs at himself. And that, to me, captures something that we don't usually associate with Dante. We do make mistakes. We try our best, we judge even, but we make mistakes. We can still get to heaven. And when we get there, we smile and we laugh. And earlier in the Paradiso, he'd said that specifically. That's part of the condition of beatitude. You can see everything that you've done, including what previously you thought of as sin, but it's all part of the journey that got you to heaven. And one of the reasons why this is significant, I think, is that at the end of Purgatorio 28, Virgil smiles.
Yes.
And on the question of Virgil, I think that he learns to smile. There's something in it on this journey for Virgil. Again, that's something we're not used to thinking about. Virgil, through purgatory, learns to smile.
Beautiful.
Does he go back to limbo? I don't know. but there seems to be some incompletion there for us to think about. Yeah.
That's wonderful. How about Angela and John? Anything?
If I can pick up on the smile and the
Yeah.
laughter, there are many favorite moments, of course, but one of my favorites is in the Paradiso 22, when Beatrice takes Dante up so that he's very high up in the heavens, and he's able to look down at earth. And he says as he looks down, "With my sight, I returned through every one of the 7 spheres, and I saw this globe, our little earth, to be such that I smiled at its base appearance. The little threshing floor that makes us so ferocious appeared to me, all of it from mountains to the river mouths. And then I turned my eyes back to her lovely eyes." So this wonderful vision that Dante is given of us in our pathetic
Jostling.
selfishness and evil, and he doesn't smile very often in the poem, and that's a moment for him of recognition and a moment in which we all, see ourselves through Dante.
Beautiful. John, anything come to mind?
Not a lot, but I'm just looking at the title of this book, midway in the journey. "El mezzo del camino," ovviamente, is being alluded to here, and I'm thinking of what Heaney said about T.S. Eliot, that Dante belonged in the rag and bone shop of Eliot's middle-aged heart, and this capacity of Dante to impact on writers very often halfway through their journey and to totally change their direction. I think that certainly happened with Seamus Heaney.
Wonderful, beautiful. How about you all now? Let's open it up. Even if you've never read Dante, of course you are after this session. You're going to go immediately to the bookstore. But if you have perhaps anything that comes to mind, are you used to thinking about Dante in these smiling ways? Or anything else? Any questions? Any? Please, good. Yes.
So
good.
thank you. Thank you very much for that very wonderful discussion. I'd like to know, how do we teach or read Dante in this age of cancel culture and sensitivity readers and trigger warnings? So. And I'm also thinking of O'Connell, right? So how do we teach or read, these works in this climate?
It's a very, very good and very timely question. Vittorio, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. It's challenging, especially thinking about the way that Dante is often read as a poet of judgment.
Yeah.
And there's a real risk in reading Dante today that strengthens, a cancel culture. And yet we have, I think, in Dante's poem, an extraordinary example of someone who wants to work through that. So one thing I often share in class is that think of the Inferno as the work of an author who wants to give you the best possible account of hell, so that you can realize that one shouldn't do that. And it's complex to read Dante that way, but I found over time that it's simpler than we might think. But it requires reading the whole poem, and so it's a challenge. There's a risk. It depends on the context as well, but I think it's a risk worth taking.
There's a recent book by Dennis Turner. I'm going to go to questions, but that's the cover that he uses. He says the Inferno is the reader's purgatorial journey. Okay, you're recognizing yourself, and he credits you, Vittorio, among others. Yes, would you agree with that statement?
Yes, there's a moment. Again, in Inferno 28, I referred earlier to Paradiso 28 and Purgatorio 28. In Inferno 28, and Dante does a lot with these vertical correspondences, there's an extraordinary moment. So Inferno 28 is the canto in which Dante explicitly refers to the contrapasso, the principle by which the punishment fits the sin. You think that that's the canto where Dante is at his most judgmental. And yet, just before that, he says that the damned, when they saw Dante going through hell, for a second were so in wonder that they forgot their suffering. That shouldn't be happening in hell. And yet, it's as if Dante is signaling, even before you get to purgatory, that part of the reason why he journeys through hell is so that we can undo this cycle of judgment, of violence, etc. Yeah.
Beautiful, thank you. There's one. Good. Joe?
Hopefully, just a quick question for the panel to go down. If I were to be looking to buy a high-quality edition of this, we talk about the translators, the betrayer, traduttore, traditore. What would you recommend if you were doing facing English, Italian? Whose translation would you get and why?
Well, in my experience, there are everyone likes a different translation for different reasons. And I run a Dante reading group at Fordham, and we went through this 6 years ago when we first started. We're reading one canto a month, so we're very slow. So we picked a couple of different translations based on what it is you want. If you're looking for poetry, if you're looking for somebody who has a great ear and who renders Dante beautifully, I love the Ciardi translation. But the problem with the Ciardi translation is sometimes he wrenches the meaning in order to get the sound and the terza rima. I think the Hollander translation is perfect in many ways because it is a combination of somebody with a very good ear, and also it's accurate and there are very good notes to it. And I also recently have been using the Sperling translation because that also is very good. Most people go for the Mandelbaum translation. I find it kind of stilted. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So I often go for the Kirkpatrick, Robin Kirkpatrick. There's a little bias there. He was one of my teachers and mentors and now sort of friends. And part of the reason for that is that he's sensitive to the theological dynamics of Dante's text, trying to render them for a contemporary Anglophone sort of readership. But one thing I've learned from Robin as well is that the answer to which one translation should I get, no, you should get at least two.
Yes.
Because no one translation will capture it.
If I had to choose a Dante translation, I'd go with the Boyagoda translation. I'm a working writer, I had to get in a little plug. But actually, I would say, I think I had 6 or 7 translations going when I was working on this novel. And the one that has stayed with me is the Hollander translation. Not just for the reasons that Angela mentioned, which I very much agree with, but actually using it is very easy in terms of the little plan that precedes every canto. The notes at the back, you can refer to them, but you don't need to. So I think even as a reading experience, I find the Hollander translations, Jean and Robert Hollander together, I find that the best edition right now.
I don't have an answer to the question. I mean, if you want a kind of a reliable translation, obviously you go for a scholarly translation, you go for Kirkpatrick or something like that. If you want to get the gist in modern language, maybe you go for a poetic translation, which doesn't worry too much about fidelity to the original, but tries to get the message across. I mean, Ulysses is a translation of Homer's Odyssey. They're quite different, but themes emerge in a very powerful way. So maybe you play around with a few translations.
There's a Scottish writer who brought one out. Gray, is that his name?
Alistair Gray.
That just happened this past year.
Yeah.
And we should put a vote in for Robert Pinsky's translation of Inferno. He has only done Inferno, but he's a marvelous poet, and if you want to experience it as a poem rather than as a text in a museum, the Pinsky is great.
And Hollander is very poetic. Jean Hollander, the wife, was a poet. Okay, more questions. Just there's no such thing as a bad Dante question. Good.
This isn't really a question, but I just have to put a word in for a translation that's new, and it's called B. B for, he calls, it's by Ned Denny, and B is for Blaze for Inferno, and Bathe for Purgatory, and Bliss for Paradiso. And it's phenomenally wonderful. I highly, highly recommend it. It's published by Carcanet in the UK, and it was published last year, and it's the most poetic of all the translations that I've read. And I just want to throw in as well that, having looked at quite a few translations lately, I just wonder whether there's a case to be made for you can't really translate Dante unless you are a Catholic believer. I just wonder whether that's something you might think is true. Because I'm thinking about Clive James's translation, which is very competent, and yet there's something very lacking in it. And to me, it seems like people who really get the faith, they get Dante and they do a really good translation. I just wonder if that's too contentious to say.
It may be, because who comes to mind, not so much her translation, Dorothy Sayers, tried it with the Terza Rima. It's hard to read, but the introduction she wrote, that was my entree back in Notre Dame graduate school days, and I think those introductions hold up. I think she gets something very, yeah, it's remarkable. Other questions or thoughts?
Who did the B? Who was the? Denning. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Could you say that again, Mary? Yeah, Mary Jo Bangs, yes. Good. Are you all gathering names of books for a very big order when you leave this conference? I know I am. Are there other questions or observations or anything else? Well,
Or dinner time.
exactly. This is in the spirit of Dante's surprise. We're going to end early. Okay, you got 7 minutes. Well, maybe not. Maybe I jumped the gun. Thank you.